the weaker Russia is in Ukraine, the higher the risk of some much more profound military threat against a European NATO country.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Dr. Alina Polyakova, President and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, and Peter Rao, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute. Alina and Peter join us today to discuss key takeaways from the recent NATO Summit and their broader geopolitical implications. Stay with us as we speak with Dr. Alina Polyakova and Peter Rao. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Alina, for coming. Alina, you and your terrific organization, SIPA, have many scholars and followers of NATO issues in particular. I know you had a lot of people on the ground for the summit. Give us a readout of the big takeaways, but also, I know you all have a particular expertise in defense tech and some of those issues. Please talk about defense tech for large companies and small.
Well, Michael, thanks so much. It's great to be here and great to see you and Peter as well. When I look back at last week at Ankara, as you mentioned, Michael, we as an institution hosted a ton of events, particularly at the intersection of European defense investment, defense tech. The sense I got from my team that was on the ground and just from reading everything that came out of the summit is one, it was a big success. That's the top line. There was a lot of anxiety, as we all know, going into the summit from European allies because President Trump, goes back and forth as to, when he wants to criticize European allies. And there was certainly a lot of that. But I think the bottom line is that the SecGen Ruta did a great job preparing the conversation with the president. He came to Washington, made a big case for why Europe is spending so much more. That credit is very much deserved by President Trump. So I think everybody in Europe's side, a big breath of relief. And we got a very, very strong statement from the Ankara summit, particularly not just on ironclad Article 5 commitment, which is the bare minimum that everybody was looking for, but very strong language on support for Ukraine. I thought one particular note was important, which was the acknowledgement that Ukraine is a security asset for NATO, which is relatively new, I think, framing from going from being a security liability, just how Ukraine has been seen. And so my top line point there, which is point number 2, is that if we look at who were the winners from the summit, Ukraine is obviously the big winner. Not only did Zelensky have a very positive press conference with the president, it didn't, devolve into now very well-known Oval Office conversation. They joked, there was friendliness. Of course, we have President Trump saying that there will be licensing for Patriot systems that Ukraine can build. That's obviously going to take some years. And we don't know really the timeline for that, export agreement, but Ukraine won big. There's a big loan coming from the EU, great statement from Ankara, all good. I think the other big winners from the summit was the defense investment community, particularly the investment banks. We have seen NATO work much more closely and really take control of the defense industry day, which for the first time was an official part of the summit organized by the SecGen's office. He leaned in particularly very heavily to make sure that the industry day was a big success. And I think it was. They announced around 50 billion in new deals, acknowledgement of some of the major investment bank players there, Deutsche Bank, Citi in particular, I thought was notable. Barclays, many others on the list. Also notable who was not on that list in SecGen's statement. So big win for, I think, the investment community, which has been looking for signals from the European allies, from NATO, as to how long of an investment in defense Europe is going to make, right? We all know the timelines for the production of some of these exquisite systems, but also, any weapons capabilities take time. they take co-production, they take joint ventures, and budgets don't tend to work that way in the public sector. You're not going to get a 10-year budget commitment. So there's a lot of apprehension that I've been hearing for last several years, particularly from the big, private equity investment bank communities, that they want signals. I think we got a pretty clear signal that this is not a blip. The European defense spending isn't going anywhere. It's gone up 20% just in the last year. If we look at what European allies are spending on defense, that's huge. SecGen credited the president with a Trump trillion. You can decide how you want to count those contributions, but clearly that there's an upward trajectory here. My last point on the last winners from the summit, absolutely the defense tech companies. And when I say defense tech companies, I'm talking about, the small startups in Ukraine that are producing dozens and dozens of different kinds of drones and testing them in theater immediately, to some of the, you could say, larger prime, almost prime type companies that we all know about. They're doing fantastic work like Andrew Palantir and others. They got a big win because NATO committed to not just accelerating NATO's integration of defense tech capabilities into NATO capability targets, which they agreed to last year, but a 5-year long 40 billion investment on top of what NATO has already been doing, which I think has not been enough, through its NATO investment fund and its accelerator, innovation accelerator, Diana. So, okay, look, 40 billion over 5 years. I still think that's not enough, frankly, but it's moving in the right direction. And I think what has really looked like a gold rush in European defense market is now becoming step by step a more, I would say, not quite predictable market, but certainly it's no longer, there's less confusion, less ambiguity about where Europe is going. And I think this summit really put an anchor in that long-term trajectory. So I think I'll just stop there. I'm happy to dig into all of this and to give Peter the floor.
Right. Thank you. That was terrific. Peter, I was wondering if you could give us your top lines on the NATO summit.
Great. Well, first of all, Michael, it's wonderful to be with you and Beacon Global Strategies, which I almost think of as like its own CIA substation here in Washington, given that everywhere you look, there are Beacon analysts picking up data and information and converting that into policy advice and strategy advice. And to be paired with the inimitable Alina Polyakova is a real honor. So thanks for having me. I'll just start by saying I think of this summit as the fifth in a 5-part play. The first was just after the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Madrid summit, which brought Sweden and Finland, or began the process of bringing Sweden and Finland into the alliance and reoriented NATO to focus on the Russia threat with a new policy document, strategic guidance called the Strategic Concept. Next came the meeting in Vilnius when that strategic concept, which reoriented the alliance on Russia, put together a series of battle plans that were ratified for how to resource and defend the alliance, where different countries were assigned various capabilities that were required to take on the Russians. Then came the Washington summit, which I suppose we could say was meant to juice President Biden's reelection campaign, but also was meant to put some meat on the bones to really put markers down on how countries were performing and reaching those capabilities targets. Then we went with President Trump back in office to The Hague, where the Trump administration wanted to put a bit more athleticism into the alliance, raise the bar for ambition, and that's where we had this now much discussed 5% of GDP for defense target that was adopted by all the allies save Spain. And this year in Ankara, we had the fifth of the 5-part plays, and that was really hooked in part to the Secretary General's burden sharing report, keeping track of where the alliance was on hitting those 5% targets and beginning the process of substituting American conventional power for European conventional power. Ideally, that is a carefully designed, coordinated process where in a step-stair fashion, the Americans come down in certain categories and the Europeans come up. I do think it's the fifth of 5 parts, though, because I somewhat doubt that there'll be a summit next year. It's become a habit in the post-Cold period for summits to take place annually, but this was not the case during the actual Cold War, and it forces NATO bureaucrats to rush around looking for so-called deliverables each year at these summits, straining a little bit that which each country can announce. And on top of that, I think it just creates a level of political angst. The president said in his pull aside with Mark Rutte in the Oval Office prior to their private meeting in the lead up to the summit that the only reason he went is owing to his close personal relationship with President Erdogan, which is one of the strongest bilateral relationships he has in the world. And if we were to go to Albania next year, who's to say if President Trump would even show up, at which point is it really much of a summit? I don't think there's anything final there yet, but that would be my prediction. I'd also say that the story of the summit is, in public, the defense industrial base, which Alina mentioned, and in private, really discussions on Ukraine. And while there were a few smattering of public moments, the bilateral meeting with President Erdogan, which had a presser hook to it, there Greenland came up and began dominating some of the day one coverage. Also, the arrival ceremony where President Erdogan, in true Ottoman style, welcomed the leaders of the alliance for photographs, and then of course the summit declaration, which matters a lot. Some of that is pre-cooked, some of it finalized at the summit. The real, I think, meeting that matters most is the private this private North Atlantic Council meeting and the dinner of the leaders, which had arrived. And there, the reporting and some of the backstory, which we've heard, is that there was actually a rather positive and collaborative conversation that took place. The president said that he wants to be with the alliance, that he wants to be with NATO, and I think a lot of encouragement was taken from that. If I could just make a brief comment on the defense industrial base and even Ukraine. On the defense industrial base, I think the story is really the new money that is coming online, in particular in Europe. We'll see what the American defense budget looks like next year. The president's obviously anchored at 1.5 trillion, but there's a lot of new European money coming online. And I think the real issue is Europeans, to justify spending this much money, will want to assign and dole out that money to European companies, which is to say a lot of American defense industry will have to become more European to access that money via some sort of subsidiary structures, joint ventures, or other mechanisms. The same goes for the Ukrainians, who've built up this tremendous defense industry, but there are caps on that owing to export controls. Naturally, they're fighting a war. They want their drones used against the Russians and not exported to other parts of the world. And venture capital and other financing limitations, given that no one's quite sure when the war will end. And I think there is a worry that a big investment will then at some point wither on the vine during a ceasefire period. And so Ukrainian companies, perhaps through small changes in their IP, relocating to Europe, launching separate ventures there or similar ventures, can begin to access European money that's coming along online as well. That's some of the discussion of the defense industrial base that I think is significant in the background. And on Ukraine's strategic position within the alliance or with the alliance or in talking to the alliance, here I think we're toggling between what the Russians like to call the spirit of anchorage and what the Europeans are describing as the spirit of Evian. The spirit of anchorage refers to, quite obviously, the meeting that President Trump hosted in Alaska with President Putin, and what the Russians claim to have been some loose understandings coming out of that discussion. Whereas the spirit of Evian describes the rather positive G7 meeting that was held in the lead up to the Ankara summit. And I think, owing to Ukrainian battlefield successes, Russian obstinance, the Europeans and the administration feel as though backing Ukraine, being supportive of Ukraine, as we saw in the summit declaration, is where we are swinging right now in the pendulum between the spirit of anchorage and the spirit of Evian. And then the last point, I think the president really views this alliance as a series of individual relationships. I think that's how he views a lot of Europe. And Mark Rutte is very much so at the top of that list of persons and leaders whom he gets along with very well. But there are others too. And maybe I'll just close by saying that one major interlocutor who was at the Ankara summit, who'd really done yeoman's work in helping advance American interests in all of this, was Lindsey Graham. And so it's a real loss for the U.S. It's a loss for South Carolina. It's a loss for the administration. It's a loss for the NATO alliance in Europe that Senator Graham, rest in peace, passed away so shortly after. Of course, he was, as he would be, in Ankara and then had traveled to Kyiv. So I just wanted to give a shout out to him and pay my respects to his family and all of those that are part of his political family. And as we saw on Twitter, there are many of them that have been built up as part of the Lindsey Graham team over the decades.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. He was, fighting for the United States national security posture up until the very end. It's fitting that he was visiting Ukraine and had just returned from meeting with Zelensky. Before we go deeper into the situation in Ukraine, let me ask both of you, how many years is it? I mean, it's great that the Europeans are up to 5%. It's terrific that they understand that they have a defense industrial base problem, but realistically, how long is it going to take for them to be online? And if one of you could address what I keep seeing, which is that the Europeans are, of course, really upset with us over the Greenland comments, and they're worried about being too single threaded to the United States. They worry about kill switches. They worry about our software. Where are we on both of those issues? Alina, can we start with you?
No, thanks, Michael. And I second a lot of what Peter also said, including the loss of Senator Graham. Um, I will see how that plays out in terms of what it means for U.S. national security and defense. But he was an important, powerful voice, especially when it came to Ukraine and Russia and the NATO alliance. And he'll be missed very much so here in Washington and beyond. But to go to your specific questions. Look, I mean, we all know Europe is not a monolith, right? And at the end of the day, it's nation states and national MODs that are making decisions about procurement and priorities. NATO sets the capability targets, and now we have regional plans, which is all positive. But at the end of the day, NATO provides guidelines, and the spending happens at the national level. So I think what I'm seeing is that we're going to not necessarily have a two-speed Europe, but definitely a multi-speed Europe. And if you want to know exactly who's in the fast lane, we'll look at who was at the so-called Bergen meeting that Undersecretary Colby organized the week before the summit, and who wasn't there as well. So this was a meeting, I think, on July 3rd, and then he announced after the fact, British Colby announced after the fact, the countries that were there were all the Nords, Poland, and Germany. So it's very clear the UK wasn't at the table, France wasn't at the table, Netherlands were there, but Denmark wasn't, right? So if we look at that grouping, and these are the countries that I think were identified as those who have the capacity, are spending the right amounts. Poland is already at 5%, for example. Germany is running at really, really fast speed these days. But then the countries that are not there, right? And so we look at France, which may have declining defense spending coming up. We look at the mess in the UK and the resignations that took place over the last several weeks on the defense and security side. Europe is going to look very different depending on where you are and where your threat assessments are. So that's a long way of kind of not answering your question, Michael, about the timelines, because it's going to depend on who you are in Europe and where you are. I don't expect, Spain or Italy, for that matter, to really contribute in a significant way over the next several years, because their defense budgets are not going up at the same rate. There's not the same threat perception that Europe is at war if you go to Southern Europe versus Northern or the Eastern flank countries. So we're going to have a Europe that looks very, very different. And I think increasingly that's something that Europeans recognize. I'm in the Nords quite frequently, in Sweden in particular. And what I hear there is we're working regionally. NATO's great, right? The Sweden-Finland NATO that provides a certain interoperability framework. But at the end of the day, it's these regional cooperation security arrangements and frameworks that are really driving change and driving spending and driving investment at a much more rapid pace in the northern eastern flank than elsewhere. And I think that is just the reality that we're going to be looking at. I think the lag is going to be quite significant, frankly. I mean, Europe is good at industrial policy, and they can produce, ammunition, quickly, more quickly than we can, as we've learned. But they're going to be reliant on us for exquisite systems. My concern, honestly, is that the biggest issue facing the European anchor of NATO is interoperability. And you, Michael, referred to this reticence, and I think growing instinct against buying American, not just when it comes to exquisite systems. The Europeans have no choice for the time being. They don't have a national champion there. There's only so many other providers like South Korea they can look to. But my real concern is the software, to be honest. Because if we don't have a common cloud across the alliance, which is a big, big question right now, whether that's going to happen, how that's going to happen, if we're not all reading from the same sheet of music, right? It goes way beyond issues around military mobility and that there's, a dozen different tanks or more across Europe. It really goes to this question of can, a NATO member talk to another NATO member? Can we have data that is exchangeable? Are we all operating from the same software capabilities as we integrate AI into our military capabilities in particular? So that's what I'm concerned about is that all of these kill switch fears and anxiety that I frankly think are pretty unfounded are going to lead to a Europe that cannot, you know, ramp up as quickly as it needs to for NATO to be a coherent, capable, and a modern alliance as the US continues to pull back, to withdraw, whatever the US policy looks like after we have our review that is supposed to conclude the next couple of months here as well, driven by Secretary Hegseth. So I don't have a good answer, but I think certainly the next 5 years, to my mind, are the critical years to see where is Europe going to go and how many speeds is it going to be going at? So I know that was long, but Peter, I want to pass it over to you as well.
I'd add two areas that I think are potential friction points, and I'm not a strategic forecaster, but there are two areas which I would encourage everyone to pay close attention to. One is that there is as I said in my opening comment, a tremendous amount of money coming online. Germany in particular will be spending the combined defense budget of the United Kingdom and France within just a few short years. And many of these states really are trying to work as quickly as possible to hit the 5% target. Having said that, they're doing so within the limits of what Secretary General Rutte describes as absorption capacity. So attempting to remain relatively efficient. And so when we see the 5% target, oftentimes attached to that is the figure 2030s and somewhere in the 2030s. The administration, however, will point to what are Europe's very own intelligence estimates that are periodically publicized. The Estonians came out with one ahead of the Munich Security Conference. The Danes published an open source intelligence or an unclassified intelligence assessment that got a lot of attention some months ago. And both of those point with a great deal of alarm to the potential of Russian aggression in the next 3 to 4 to 5 years. And those two timelines don't necessarily align. So you can see the administration, while on the one hand, encouraging and supporting the European partners and allies' commitment to at least hitting 5%, at the same time cajoling and nudging, and at other times maybe even going so far as to whip those Europeans who they don't think are moving quickly enough to hit those targets. That tension, I think, will be there in the coming years. And the second is in areas of trade and cross-border commerce, where we have a joint statement issued last August that codifies or at least lays out the groundwork of the Turnberry Agreement, where there are a few areas that are still left somewhat ambiguous and where different interpretations could lead to trade friction. For example, in paragraph 11 of the Turnberry Agreement joint statement, the Europeans paragraph 17 address the unjustified digital trade rule so that the U.S. Wants addressed. But what is unjustified? The Europeans may have one very view of that, the Americans another. Paragraph 11 talks about the American taking note of the American complaints about the carbon border adjustment mechanism and how to address that. But really putting meat on the bones and reaching agreement on that could lead to some friction. And we're already seeing that. The Digital Markets Act being expanded to cloud, for example, is one area. But there are many others. A lot of Americans, and this is a bipartisan position, not a MAGA or a Republican or an America First, but a cross-party U.S. view that the Digital Service Act really is an anti-American effort to extract rents from major American tech companies. And so I expect an implementation of the Turnberry Agreement where, yes, we have tariff levels set, but on some of the services and other areas of commerce where there is still vague language, there being some disagreement. So those are the two areas, one being the speed at which Europe rearms, the other being the implementation of our trading arrangement, where I expect there to be periodic friction.
We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Dr. Alina Polyakova and Peter Rao.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Okay, let's pivot. Here we are, 30 minutes in. Let's go directly into Ukraine. I think as everyone's read and noticed, there is a sense that the Ukrainians are doing extraordinarily better. And if they're not winning, they certainly are not losing. And a lot of that, I think, is the Russians are unable to produce new 35,000 troops each month to make up for its losses. The Ukrainians have gotten more creative with their drone warfare and any number of other things that we could talk about. How real, first, is the Ukrainian progress? And will this lead to a change in U.S. policy where the president might, instead of pressuring Zelensky to compromise, begin to pressure Putin to compromise to get to his goal of a ceasefire? Peter, why don't we start with you?
I do think that there is been a relatively dramatic change, which we can overemphasize, but I think is nonetheless important and real. Innovations in drone warfare and Ukraine's ability to mid-range strike logistics has really put the Russians on their back heels. They're hitting not only supply chains heading into, for example, Crimea and to other parts of the front line, but they're also degrading Russian refining infrastructure. Port facilities are now hitting tankers in the Sea of Azov and out on the seas. All of this puts a tremendous amount of political pressure, I think, on Vladimir Putin. Moreover, while the Russians are still grinding away in an attritable way at the front line, they're not making a great deal of progress, and they're suffering enormous casualties, as you just mentioned, to try and continue. And if they're going to continue going by contract soldiers, it's going to be difficult to sign up 35 to 50,000 troops a month to make up for those losses. The prisons have essentially been emptied. And we can see in the regions that the amount of money being paid out for new contract soldiers keeps going up, and some regions are unable to hit their quotas, or they're unable to hit the numbers, at least, that the Russians need to sustain this effort. And so it's very difficult for the Russians to keep moving forward. At the same time, the Ukrainian counteroffensive successes are, I think, still relatively localized. I don't think anybody believes that they can cut through and retake Mariupol, for example, and liberate the territories that are under Russian occupation right now. And so I think we're really moving along a timeline that's centered on winter. The Ukrainians would like to get to a negotiation, and I think they're prepared to accept line of contact before the winter, given that winter was so brutal last year, and it's likely to be brutal again. And we should fully expect, given the dearth of Patriot 3 interceptors, which are the only ones that can truly hit the Kinzhal air ballistic missiles with reliability. The Iran war could kick off again. The Gulf states want to replenish their systems, et cetera, et cetera. There's only so much of those, and I don't think the Ukrainians would like to be in a position again where their critical infrastructure is being destroyed by the Russians and the population is being frozen out across the country through the brutal Ukrainian winter. At the same time, I think the Russians would like to get to winter. If they can grind forward, get to winter, and freeze out the Ukrainians, then see where negotiations go, and if they can't break the population altogether. So I think they're kind of operating on two different clocks. The Ukrainians want to accelerate the clock towards a negotiation. The Russians probably want to slow it down, all with a mind towards the winter. And the war is relatively dynamic. I mean, you can make the case for the Ukrainians now that there's a massive loan facility that's been put in place, 90 billion euros that the EU has announced. Hungarian veto has been lifted for the Ukrainians. And, the summer months are rather pleasant in Ukraine, so they're not feeling the brutal cold of the winter. And they see these huge successes that they're having, which are reinforced by long fuel lines coming out of the Russian Federation they think that they've got a way forward. And I don't think they're prepared to make massive concessions like giving up territory in return for a ceasefire. Similarly, I think who knows how Vladimir Putin is being briefed and how cocooned he is. But he, I'm sure, is still being told that a victory is just around the corner. If only we can push a little bit more. Look, the Ukrainians are reshuffling their government just now. The Americans and the Europeans at times are at odds with one another over Ukraine. If we can keep pressing, if we can coerce the Europeans, maybe through hybrid attacks to wind down some of their support, breaking Ukraine is possible. And why should we accept anything less than at least taking Donetsk and Luhansk, these two provinces in the Donbass? That's a minimal worry for Vladimir Putin. And at minimal, we should continue through the end of the year and not be weak and soft and give up prematurely. So I think those are two competing mindsets, which suggests to me that we're not yet close to a negotiated solution. But I think the Ukrainians, because they're so willing to negotiate and they're willing to share their technology, be generally supportive of the West, probably have the ear not only of the Europeans, but of the Americans more than they might have had in the past. And to put the cherry on top, and I wouldn't underestimate this, I think this is a crucial psychological component. There is a perception that the Ukrainians not only can hold serve, but potentially are making gains and can win. And what American doesn't like a winner? I think President Trump is also in that camp, and that might help us keep us towards that spirit of Evian and away from the spirit of Anchorage, as I described it earlier.
Alina, can the Ukrainians win?
Well, depends how you define winning. They certainly aren't losing, as you said, Michael, and they were never losing, frankly. I think that narrative that Ukraine was sort of bound to lose no matter what because Russia had so much more strategic depth. They had the numbers, they had the military production. We're seeing that all of those potential assets that Russia came to the war with, the Ukrainians have turned those assets into vulnerabilities. Russia's so-called strategic depth has made it a prime target for Ukraine's long-range strikes because Russia can't protect over its entire landmass, all of its critical infrastructure, especially in the energy space, and the Ukrainians are using that. They're using, the corruption, lack of training, all of those things within the Russian ranks of the military to get information, to hit supply lines, right? Obviously, we've talked a lot about, and everyone is well aware of the kind of innovation that Ukraine has been driving when it comes to drone tech. But I would say that's not even the biggest advantage the Ukrainians have had because the Russians have and are clearly adapting and adopting Ukraine's innovation. What the Ukrainians have been able to do is, I think, institute a completely new operating system into the front line. We can go into the details about that if anyone's interested, but I really credit Fyodorov, Ukraine's Minister of Defense, for being an incredibly effective integrator of not just hardware capabilities, but software capabilities into how Ukrainians are fighting the war on the front line day in, day out. And I think for the 2 points I would make, and I agree with Peter, everything he said, that I don't think that there is a short-term deal on the horizon. And I think you, Michael, and Peter have heard me say that there's a basic formula, it's like algebra in place, right? The Ukraine is defending Europe. Europe is paying for that. Russia is the only country, and Putin is the only person that can actually stop the war because they started it, obviously. And President Trump and the United States is really the only country and the only leader that can pressure the Russians enough to force them to the negotiating table. So until something in that formula starts to shift dramatically, we're likely going to be in the zone that we're currently in for some time. And I think the Ukrainians' goal is not to regain territory that they've lost, right? Because we have this drone wall in effect now on the front line. It's impossible for either side to really take significant territory, which is why we're not seeing that anymore. But there's, I think, renewed morale in Ukraine, despite the losses, and which are significant. They're seeing that they're able to impose significant costs. They're reducing how many men and women they're losing on the front lines. But at the end of the day, I think their goal is to reach some sort of, if not in agreement or treaty, by de facto frozen line of conflict, more or less, to stop taking on the losses and for the rest of Ukraine to move forward with the EU accession, potentially sometime down the road, many years down the road, potentially joining NATO, but until then, contributing to NATO's security as the largest, most capable force in Europe. The one thing I'll say is that there's something happening in Russia right now as well that I would not underestimate. The Ukrainians putting Crimea under pressure is truly significant. Crimea holds uh, such an important role in Russia's and Russians' understanding of Russian nationhood. And it may sound odd to an American or Western audience, but it is kind of at the heart and soul of this entire operation. And so we assumed that Crimea was going to be, Russian forever, most likely. But the Ukrainians are now showing they can put Crimea under risk. There's gas lines there. There's empty shelves, which was reminding people a lot of the shortages in the Soviet era and in the 1990s. Those are really bad memories. That's exactly what Putin promised back in 2000 that people would never ever see again in Russia: shortages, criminality, gas lines. They're seeing that now in Crimea, and people in the mainland, Russia proper, are noticing. The other two factors I would say that I've noticed recently, I don't know if most of you saw the cover of The Economist, where there's this long interview based on 60 hours of conversations with Russia's richest industrialist, Milichenko, who's known as the fertilizer king. And he's a Putinist through and through. But the fact that you have someone like this out there saying that Russia faces a bleak economic future, we can only surmise why he's doing this and what the consequences could be, or whether this is really he's doing it with Putin's agreement. But the fact that you have someone at that level speaking directly to the Western media like this is significant, and being critical is significant. The other significant things that have been happening is in the Russian Duma. We have had the Speaker of the Russian Parliament, the Duma, speak out publicly just this month about the budget problems they're having. We've had other members of the Duma say these things publicly. This has been unheard of in Putin's Russia, certainly since the full-scale invasion. So there's anxiety, there are complaints being aired. The sanctions, Western sanctions, have not had the kind of effect that many anticipated, but what they are having an effect on is access to lines of credit. So the Russians are hyperspending for all the reasons that Peter mentioned on the war, yet they can't get loans, right? The Chinese aren't forking up big credit lines. The Western sanctions are preventing other countries from doing so. So they're not necessarily going to fall off a cliff economically, but there's certainly fragility there that is becoming increasingly noticeable and increasingly public. And I think that's a very new development. So if we wanted to, I think, speed up the timeline that the Russians are trying to slow down, as Peter said, now would be the time to turn up the heat on the economic pressure. And I really am hopeful that the sanctions legislation that, of course, Senator Graham led, that is on the table now again, and President Trump seems more likely to support it, will move forward, and we will see if that has the kind of key effect of pressuring the Russians, not in the short term, but perhaps in the next year or two.
Can I just add one or two points that I wanted to make but neglected? One is just because of the advance in drone warfare and other autonomous inputs into the Ukrainian war effort, the focus on Ukraine's personnel shortages has somewhat waned in the Western media, but it's still pronounced and real, which is, I think, another reason, or a reason, why the Ukrainians would be eager to go to negotiation and aren't trying to overplay their hand, to use that now cliched metaphor of card playing. But I was in Kyiv a few months ago, and I met with an ambassador from a major Western supporter of Ukraine, who also had spent a significant amount of time in the Middle East. And he made this astute point that the Iran-Iraq war was dragging on, and the Iranians were content to keep slogging away until Tehran started being hit. And the attacks on Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are now within the sights of Ukrainian long-range drones, are meaningful, I think, and have a psychological component. I suppose the reason why I think in the end Putin is prepared to continue on for now is, number one, his economy is in tatters, but I don't think he prioritizes the economies over other priorities, which is to say the economy is subordinate to security. He's a trained intelligence officer. He comes from the security services. And while the economic forecast is wretched for Russia, I think he wants to plow through and maybe even solve this problem by taking Ukraine. Ukraine itself is an economic prize in his mind. Secondly, he really has cast this as a war not just against Ukraine, but a war against the West altogether. And when you reference 90 billion loan facilities for Ukraine, when you reference the cumulative effect of sanctions that Alina just mentioned, he has a lot of data points to make that argument. The West isn't in the war itself, but it's of course a big supporter. And by expanding the aperture and raising the stakes, he can justify greater sacrifices. So the Duma, they're having these debates Alina mentioned. Now the Kremlin has taken a lot of the budgetary powers from the legislation and moved it in-house. So there's fewer debates on this and they can be short-circuited. And there's always a mobilization option for Putin where he can go to mass conscription. I mean, right now there's basically a deal that if you're conscripted, you can go drink vodka and smoke cigarettes at some far-flung outpost within the Russian Federation, but you won't be deployed to Ukraine. Only contract soldiers are, which is maybe why the Ukrainians made such short work of those detachments in Kursk when they went into the Russian Federation proper, because those were not men really trained and ready to fight.
Yeah, great. Well, let me ask you both, and we all want to read this Economist article. What's giving them the confidence to speak out now? Is it that things are going so badly that the cost benefit analysis has changed and they feel like they need to ring the bell to try and get Putin's attention? What is it that's causing oligarchs and others to finally stand up and say this is an open flesh wound?
So that's a great question, Michael. I think I wouldn't over-index, reading the tea leaves, right? Because you never really know what's going on behind closed doors. And frankly, we have so little access into the political elite in Russia because they've learned their lesson. You speak out against the Tsar, right, Mr. Putin, and you might accidentally fall out a window or have a heart attack at the age of 39, right? So they know what the lines are. And to be clear, no one is criticizing the war. That would be, suicide, literally. What they are starting to speak out about is the budget problem. And that's not, what's new is that it's happening by political leaders who are pro-Putin, pro-war, generally speaking. There's nobody that's anti-war in the Russian political elite anymore. But it's also reflecting the mood in the country. And this is not something you'll see in polling in Russia, of course. It's very difficult to get accurate polling in a state that controls the information environment. It's an authoritarian state. But I can just tell you from having contacts in Russia, speaking to even some family members in Russia still from far-flung parts of the family, people feel the economic anxiety, the inflation, the interest rates. They're 20%. The Russian way of solving these monetary problems is to print more money. But there's only so long that you can maintain that. And so all of this has been brewing for a long time. The central bank, their central banker has been frankly brilliant in managing the sanctions problem, and the Russian economy has been surprisingly resilient. And the Iran war, which we haven't mentioned yet, has given them a bit of a cash injection because of the high oil prices, right? But not enough to really solve the underlying problems that the Russian economy has. Now, I don't want to suggest that, there's a fiscal cliff coming. There isn't. The Russian state can muddle through. They will take more money from domestic programs, which are only running on empty, basically, because everything is going towards the war effort. But, eventually, Putin, who I think is in a very close circle, as Peter mentioned, who is likely getting a lot of everything's going well, sir, kind of information, his political maneuver space is more and more constrained, which makes him much more vulnerable, I think, to internal criticism. And what I mean by that is he has staked not just the country's future, but his own personal survival, and I do mean that in an existential way, on getting a win in Ukraine. And the longer this goes on, the more they lose, the more money oligarchs continue to lose, the harder it becomes for him to sell a loss as a win, which he could have done for a long time. And he's refused to do that, which signals, I think, that people are speaking out probably because they're losing confidence in Putin's ability to continue to manage the hyperspending, given the kind of, inflationary stagnation, economic trends that they're seeing. Whether that will lead to a rift, again, I'm skeptical, but it's just something to note that may speed up the desire for some sort of negotiation while he can still call a loss a win.
Yeah, I hear you. Okay. As we begin to wrap up here, let me ask you both to just sort of put on, look into your crystal ball. Should we expect in the Russia-Ukraine front coming? Is it a ramp up of U.S. sanctions? Is it a further deterioration of the Russian position? Will, Russia make a bit of a comeback? Tell us what to look for predictions wise, but also what's coming up on the calendar. You mentioned the winter. That obviously changes a lot. What else should we be looking for?
Sure. Well, I think the Ukrainians have right now an innovation edge, but they're aware that there have been innovation edges in past phases of the war, and that window could close. And so I would expect in the coming weeks and months, and I don't think this is a secret, President Zelensky talks about this openly, a campaign to really take advantage of this window they have to strike deep into the Russian territory, to hit as much refining as possible, to spread air defenses thin, and try to hit Russia where it hurts and make big political sort of ripple effects. Second, I would expect that to lead to further economic deterioration. The Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund is set to run dry, the liquid assets in the Sovereign Wealth Fund, by the end of the year based on Russian deficit spending trends. A resumption of the war in Iran notwithstanding, I mean, there'd have to be a structural change in the price of oil over many, many, many months for the Russians to be able to make up their deficits there. And a slow but sure descent of Russia into second league status below kind of a Sino-American world. And I think this is really, and not to betray any sources, but this is something I think the Ukrainians have picked up in Moscow, some of the worries in Russian leadership circles, that if they don't punch through and manage to take the rest of the Donbass and at least have something they can sell at home as a partial victory by the end of the year, then the situation becomes pretty dire for them. So I think a big Russian push to try to reverse the innovation edge, to try to take the fortress belt, to see if Zaporizhia city opens up, and it's really the Ukrainian air campaign versus the Russians trying to push forward on the ground. Beyond that, I don't know how U.S. policy reacts. I do think that Senator Graham's death sort of injects more energy into the debate around those sanctions, but it's so fresh and so new, and I haven't spoken to anyone on Capitol Hill in the past 48 hours that I don't know what the ripple effect of that will be. But it's undoubtedly clear that President Trump feels as though the world's going a little bit more towards the Ukrainians, and that U.S. policy can move into the slipstream behind the Ukrainian success, almost draft on it in a way in the months and years to come. And that would be important. If I can make just one last point about the last question on the economics, I think a lot of these oligarchs have lost billions on account of this war, but I think they're being told by the Kremlin, if you want to keep your remaining billions, then be careful in what you say. And the threat to the Kremlin has never really been sort of like the liberal St. Petersburg artist class. It's really more the hardened internet nationalist right that says you're correct to wage the war, but you're running it too weakly. And there is no silver bullet for the Russians. There's nothing that they can pull out to kind of double down their war effort in Ukraine. But I think Putin's aware of that. And the question is, can there be a counterpole to that, which is the business elite that does make the argument that for economic reasons, there are limits to how far we should go on the battlefield. And can Putin utilize that in a way to create kind of balance in his domestic system so that if he does go for a temporary pause after, and if he eventually does achieve some sort of breakthrough in the Donbass, he can then continue on the war through an information campaign, a hybrid campaign, and what he's not accomplished in wartime, namely to break the Ukrainian system. Perhaps he can do it in peacetime when democratic politics take hold in Ukraine and the natural slog of kind of internal post-war debate kicks off in Kyiv. I think that's even if they pause now along the current contact line, what we should expect of the Russian game plan against Ukraine going forward.
Okay, last question. I'm reading so much about the possibility that Russia may make an incursion into a NATO state. Sometimes it's Poland, sometimes it's the Baltics. Well, what would be the purpose of that? I mean, I always hear, oh, well, it's to test our response or something. But why would he do this if he's already in a very weak position vis-a-vis Ukraine? It feels like it'd almost be opening up a new can of worms for him. Alina, is this a real thing to worry about, and where's it coming from?
Absolutely. I do think it's real, and in fact, it's already happening. Right, we have seen probably hundreds at this point of various kinetic, but below the conventional threat level incursions into NATO airspace. Even on the ground, we've had drones land in Romania and Poland. We've had jamming of GPS signals for civilian aircraft. I mean, we have, the list goes on. And hybrid, I think, doesn't quite even capture the kinetic level of what the Russians have been doing against NATO, against European members of NATO already. So we're already there in terms of the expansion of the war. And as we've been talking about, it's never really been just about a few kilometers or miles of territory in the Donbass for Putin. This is about restoring the Russian empire. To do that, you have to contest and undermine your number one enemy, which at the end of the day is the United States. So that has always been the lens through which Putin has talked about the war. And from what we can tell, that's how he thinks about this war as well. The Ukraine is simply an avenue to change global dynamics and to unseat what Putin sees as U.S. hegemony of the global order. So that's already happening. And Michael, to your question, why would he do this now? Well, launching a military intervention into Ukraine was a really bad idea, obviously. Economically, politically, from a security perspective for Russia, has made Russia, so deeply dependent on China. And there's a huge resentment against that among the Russian elite and the Russian public. But these things, the way we often think in the United States that all other actors in the world are rational, but they're not rational in the same way that we are. And no amount of incentives, for Putin personally, will make him change his mind about the desire to control Ukraine, because he sees that as such a pivotal anchor in restoring Russia as a great power, not just Russia, a country within its political borders that, plays kind of a second tier role in the global order. That's not good enough, right? And so the way the Russians have always done war, and they did this in Ukraine, they did this in Georgia and Transnistria, and you name it, and all the other contested gray zone territories, is they test the response. They've been doing that now for years in NATO. They're waiting to see if there's a hard stop and a symmetric response to what they're doing. But they're clearly laying down right now what I would say is the stage zero of military operation strategy ahead of a stage one kinetic conventional military operation. And they're in the testing zone now. And whether this is, Putin just making threats that are empty or not, we will never know until something truly tremendous happens. But actually, to my mind, the weaker Russia is in Ukraine, the higher the risk of some much more profound military threat against a European NATO country. And if you talk to the Balts or those on the eastern flank, this is basically their assessment as well. And that may not make sense to us, but this is very much, I think, the strategic thinking inside the Kremlin and for Putin personally.
So you say he's already retaliating, and you're citing all the gray zone activity that's been going on for some time. Maybe it's not even gray zone anymore. Maybe it's just a pronounced but smaller scale hot war versus, okay. Do you see any troop incursions though? Like we're going to invade and why would you do that if they're weak? Can we dismiss that as a possibility?
Look, the Russians I mean, Peter, you may have different thoughts, but I think they're spread quite thin. I mean, something like 80% of their military capabilities are in Ukraine right now, which is huge. So I don't think they have the capacity to wage a direct war, but what will they do? Well, okay, next time the 20 or so drones that dropped in Poland, that aren't unarmed might be armed next time, right? And what happens when some, Polish villages get hit and a few Poles die? Is that an Article 5 moment or not? This is what the Russians are testing. They're testing Article 5 commitments, and we're going to see an escalation of that. Now, we don't know what this latest, threat that the Polish Prime Minister was warning about, supposedly based on U.S. intelligence warnings. But certainly that is absolutely not outside the realm of possibilities, that we will see more of these kinds of military airspace incursions. You also have Kaliningrad right there, let's not forget, that's housing massive Russian military assets and strike capabilities. These are all ways in which the Russians will maintain a high threat level against NATO and will continue to test the ground going forward to see, what does Article 5 actually mean in practice? Is it as ironclad as the Ankara Declaration claims it to be?
Excellent. Peter, close us out here.
Sure. I mean, my view is that the Russians are masters at testing, withdrawing, and then observing. And so this is part and parcel of that general approach. Their attitude is they want to isolate Ukraine in a one-on-one matchup where the much larger Russia Federation can ultimately subordinate the smaller Ukraine. So long as the NATO partners and the United States are supporting Ukraine, that is much more of an even fight. And so the thinking would be, how does one coerce and push the NATO partners away? If President Putin can be convinced that an incursion into the Baltic states, number one, gets him a win, so that would shore him up at a time when it's clear to everyone that they're struggling at home. But two, could break NATO or coerce the partners and allies away from Ukraine. Maybe he will think about that. It would be foolish in the extreme, and as Alina has pointed out, the Russians have made foolish missteps in Ukraine and misread a country which they claim to be fraternal and no better than any other. But they do need to rebuild their forces. They do need to reconstitute some of their capabilities. Naval infantry, other elite units have been really ground down. And so it would be an enormous gamble of historic proportions. I suppose if I was arguing for it in the Kremlin, I would say the Europeans are rebuilding. Now is our moment of opportunity. Now is our Davidson window for the Baltic states, so to speak, and we should move before Europe is really built up and prepared. And now there might be some friction across the Atlantic. And so if we can show that the Americans won't ride to the rescue, that would destroy NATO, and all of that might be kind of swirling. But I think it's a test, observe, and then react, move more than anything else.
Okay, that's terrific. Alina Polyakova and Peter Rao, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
That was Alina Polyakova and Peter Rao. I'm Michael Allen. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.